what I was asked to do by Deirdre and Simon was to give you a brief overview of something that I know that some of you are already familiar with, but just to set the scene in terms of, as Simon says, it's not the framework, it's a framework for understanding behaviour with a specific view to changing behaviour. As we heard this morning, what we're dealing with here is essentially a behavioural problem. There are other ways of tackling the issue that have nothing to do with behaviour, and I think we've been quite successful, actually, in sort of taking behaviour out of the equation a little bit. But clearly there's an awful lot we need to do with behaviour in terms of what's left. So what I'm just going to do in the next few minutes to set the scene is to give you a sense of where I think this fits into if we see this as developing a behaviour change strategy, that involves behaviour change interventions, where I see this as fitting within that, and then to introduce this model and see how it might be applied in this particular context. And one of the things that really struck me this morning was one of the major undercurrents or threads flowing through all the presentations and the discussion was the fact that people act to our incentives. We all act to our incentives. And if you align someone's incentives in one direction, then that's the way that if they're able to do it, they will go. Even if, looking at it from the point of view of the bigger picture or even their own safety, that's something that carries inherent risks. And so misaligned incentives is a massive issue, clearly, in relation to safety. But that's only one part of the problem. That's only the motivational part of the problem. Capability and opportunity play a crucial role as well. So if we're thinking about starting from scratch, as it were, in developing a behaviour change intervention, this is just one sort of activity map and set of contextual factors that then may influence that as to how you might go about that. And the first thing to note about this is it's got a lot of cycles built into it. The thing about behaviour is you can understand the rules of behaviour just as you can understand the rules of chess, but it doesn't make you a grandmaster or an expert in changing behaviour in a particular context. There are huge issues around specific knowledge, specific understanding in specific areas that are essential in order to be able to identify effective behaviour change interventions. So I'm very conscious of the fact that as someone who hasn't worked in this field for some time, but does work in the field of smoking, when people who are very, very bright, behaviour change experts, start making pronouncements about things that might or might not work in smoking, I'm sticking my hand up saying, that doesn't work, that's not right, because they don't know the specifics of the information that's required. So there is no substitute. None of what I say is a substitute for specific knowledge, evidence, and understanding in a given area. What it is a way potentially of putting that knowledge to work. So we're at this stage, in relation to what I'm talking about, looking at developing the concept of a behaviour change intervention using existing knowledge and going through a cycle of testing at that stage. And that's a very important stage. And very often in behaviour change interventions, that stage is gone through way too cursorily. And we get to a much later stage of doing some sort of rollout of a program or a randomized trial, and it doesn't work. And then we're left with basically not knowing why, and it actually stood very little chance of working in the first place. So if we're thinking about developing the concept, which is what I'm talking about here, there are a number of different steps in the development, and I'm only going to be talking about one of those, in relation to using this model which Susan, Mickey and I have developed called the Behaviour Change Wheel. The first thing is you have to specify your behavioural target, and I won't go into the details of that, but that is that process, you'd be surprised how often that goes wrong in policy circles and in people developing interventions, because we fail to specify the behavioural target in behavioural terms, as behaviours and as specific changes that are needed to specific behaviours. But in any case, I'm not talking about that. What I'm talking about is the issue of trying to figure out what it is that needs to change in order for the behavior change to occur, because that then informs the rest of the process in terms of the kind of interventions that you want to develop. And in the behavior change wheel guide, we talk about this as a behavioral diagnosis. In a sense, it's figuring out it's not actually necessarily figuring out just what is wrong, because what is wrong can be an indication of what the solution might be, but it may not be. So, for example, what's wrong with my eyes is that they're the wrong shape. But the solution, as it turns out in this case, is not to reshape my eyes. Thank goodness. It's to wear glasses. Now, so understanding what's wrong can help to produce the solution, but making a direct correction to that is not necessarily the solution. Okay. So, in understanding behavior, this is a very simple common sense model. I think it's uncontroversial, but the ramifications go quite wide. For any of us to act in a particular way in the moment, and accidents occur in the moment, like all behavior, so we have to focus on what's happening at the moment. For anyone of us to do anything in the moment, we have to have both the capability, the physical and psychological capability to do it, we have to have the opportunity, and we have to be more motivated to do that than to do something else. And the key thing to understand about motivation is it's always a competition. Motivation in the human brain is always a competition. The human brain is always at some level thinking, what else can I be doing right now, right? And that is really important to understand, because we were talking earlier at a growth level around incentives and about people wanting to get the job done, for example, and cutting corners in terms of safety, or having other particular goals that they want to strive for in relation to things that then may jeopardize safety. And at a systemic level, we have to decide as a society what sacrifices we may be willing to make in order to be able to get our safety record up, if there are indeed competing priorities, and usually there are. So that's the issue. And this just represents that graphically in terms of the influences that take place. So what we see is capability and opportunity acting as a moderator on the link between motivation and behavior. But it's more complex than that, because capability, opportunity, and behaviors are part of a dynamic interacting system. You change one and the others change. And that can be good, it can be helpful for us in terms of creating a new configuration of the system which is working better, but it can also, and very often, is problematic because the system reconfigures itself. You push it in one place and it pops out in another place. And so you end up back where you started. And a lot of, talking about behavioral economics a bit earlier, a lot of the mistakes that are made in behavioral economics are failing to understand that if you create new incentive structures within a system that is fundamentally not changed in terms of the values, priorities, capabilities, and opportunities, then all you've done, as the Department of Health have done for the last few years, is to waste money on incentives that don't work. And in the case of smoking, for example, we're spending 80 million quid a year incentivizing GPs to press a button on their computer which says that they've advised someone to stop smoking, when the evidence is that it hasn't changed behavior at all. So that's a lot of money wasted. Imagine how many surveys you could do with that money. So that's a more realistic way of capturing that system. So now I just want to finish, as it were, finish in the last half of this bit by going into a little bit more detail of these things specifically in a sort of traffic context or in a road safety context. Let's just look at capability. What is capability? It is within an individual, it's within a person. By the way, the model is not just an individual model, and it's not a psychological model. It's intended to be a model that can bring together the various different disciplines that Simon was talking about. Because Susan and Mickey and I are both psychologists, there's inevitably going to be a sort of person-centric and psychology-centric approach to it, but it is our goal for it not to be. And with Simon's help, we sometimes get closer towards that goal, but we don't always succeed. Anyway, so physical and psychological capability. Well, in terms of physical capability, you can think in terms of physical skills, like your motor skills, steering control, gear change, all the things that we think of in psychomotor tasks. But it can also be things around physical strength, for example, with older drivers and so on. It can be about stamina, physical stamina, muscular endurance. So remembering this model is not just about driving, this is about any kind of behavior. And structural, have you got the right number of legs in order to be able to achieve this task, for example, or do you have a functioning visual system or auditory system or whatever. And then when it comes to psychological capability, obviously we've got the well-known hazard perception capability, which actually I've put in there hazard prediction capability, because actually a lot of what we're interested in is not so much the perception of a hazard when it occurs, but the prediction of a hazard that from the cues which tell us that something is about to go wrong. In relation to psychological strength, self-control and self-regulatory skills are really, really important in areas that we're interested in. If you are someone who naturally gets angry when people disrespect you, as happens a lot on the roads, then this is an issue that you may have to address and that may need to be addressed in relation to making you safe. Stamina, resistance to tiredness. We heard very, very interesting work on what's going on in relation to fatigue. Some people have a greater propensity to be able to resist that than others under different circumstances. Remember, this is all in the moment. Structure, to what extent do we have functioning, for example, memory system? What about opportunity? This is the immediate environment in which we find ourselves. And we can divide it just heuristically up into the physical environment and the social environment. And both of these are obviously incredibly important. And one of the problems that we have in psychology very often is the neglect of the environment. We try to explain behavior in terms of what's going on inside someone's head. And actually what's driving behavior primarily is, or the difference between one person and another, is actually the circumstances in which we find ourselves. There's the classic psychological model or principle called the fundamental attribution error. And the fundamental attribution error is a tendency to attribute other people's behavior to what's going on inside their head and our own behavior to what's going on outside in the environment. And it's a very common mistake that we all make, even psychologists. So in terms of the physical environment, there's issues around time. There's the physical deadlines, how quickly you need to respond in order to be able to achieve a particular goal or prevent something bad happening. There's your resources, financial and other resources that are available. There's the environmental prompts and cues, very beloved of behavioral economists and nudge theorists, putting the sweets, out of reach of children. That'll be the day. Anyway, or more likely putting fruit, by the checkout in the vain hope that someone's actually going to go to that and think, that looks nice. Anyway, I'm sure it does work, really. It just doesn't work with me, anyway. And then you've got issues around access. So all of these things are critical, but they're also absolutely critical in the social environment. It goes without saying that social norms are fundamental drivers of behavior. Social norms set the boundaries within which behavior can occur. But the reason they don't tend to appear very much in the behavior change wheel is because they permeate so much of it. That's why they're so powerful. Not only do they set our social incentives, what we get socially rewarded and punished for, but they also set they frame the way we think about things, and they frame the modeling of our behavior. So they are absolutely critical to what's going on. But you can deconstruct a lot of the social opportunity in terms of things like the social influences that are going on, peer support, triggers, and so on. And then finally, the motivation. I'm not going to go into the details. That's a whole other course in itself. But Simon very kindly helped me with developing a theory of motivation called prime theory. It's not a theory of motivation that aims to replace other theories. What it seeks to do is to put them in a broader framework so that you can see how they relate to each other. in the area of smoking, for example, you can't understand smoking purely as a choice mechanism, because you'll miss out. Why would a drug like varenicline be so effective at helping people stop smoking? It's an alpha-4 beta-2 partial agonist on the nicotinic acetylcholine receptor. It's not a choice thing. What it's doing is operating at a much more basic level within the reinforcement system within the brain. So we have to put choice together with operant conditioning, classical conditioning, social learning, all these other things. And so this is an attempt to do that. But the key point I want to get across in this slide is just that in order to change someone's motivation, at the end of the day, what we're dealing with is the balance between the impulses and the inhibitions going on in behavior at a given moment. And that is very, very evident in any sort of safety culture. It's what happens in that moment that determines what happens. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that led up to it. And it may be that by the time you get to that moment, the die was cast and there's nothing you could do about it. I remember David Clark at Nottingham getting involved in beautiful Markov analyses of the chain of events leading up to accidents. And my probably unreasonable but slight caricature of what those Markov chains look like, using the driver's reports and the accident reports and so on. I was driving along and then I had a crash. But if that's true, which to some extent it feels like it's true to people, is that because whatever those factors were in that Markov process that led to that final moment, they weren't the things that people were picking up on in terms of the risk factors, and because the risk factors were actually broader in the environment in which they were operating, and most of the time an accident didn't occur. Anyway, the point about this is that if you had to take away one message, it doesn't matter what we think we should do if it doesn't make us feel that we want or need to do it. So thinking something is a good idea doesn't get through our animal brain into our actions unless, and it can do, but it only does it when it makes us want or feel that we want or need to do it. And then finally, looking at behavior, critically in behavior, as I say, it's always a competition. Very often what you're looking at is substituting one behavior for another to compete with the behavior you're trying to discourage, or creating facilitatory behaviors in order to make that happen. As I say, the whole thing is a system. So the key points, I guess, are when we're trying to figure out what to do, put the picture together, then there is a way of doing it. It doesn't provide the answers. It doesn't even provide you with a beginner's guide to chess. All it gives you is the beginnings of the rules of chess, so that at least you can make legal moves. That's a start. There's no substitute for specific knowledge in specific areas, but a behavioral analysis can provide a way of applying that knowledge, and the Combi model is an attempt to do that. And then once you've got a sense of what it is that needs to change, and you're pretty clear what you think needs to change, then you can look at what the options are for the interventions to do that. And that's just the website, thebehaviorchangewheel.com, if you've not come across it. Thank you.